Vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance went viral for a recent speech where he argued that America is not just an idea, but instead, America is a specific place and a specific people. On this episode of Forge and Anvil, I will be joined by Ben Crenshaw to discuss the myth of the propositional nation. All this and more, so stick around. Welcome to Forge and Anvil, where we hammer out uncomfortable conversations to sharpen ourselves for the cultural, political, and spiritual war that we are living in. My name is Connor. I am host of this podcast. I'm a husband, a father, and a follower of Christ Jesus, doing my best to represent him well wherever I go. As I mentioned in the intro, I'm joined today by Ben Crenshaw. So, Ben, go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience and give us a little short bio about who you are and what you do.
Hi, Connor. Good to be here. Thanks for having me on. My name is Ben Crenshaw. I have no relation to the PGA golfer, Ben Crenshaw. Just have to get that out of the way because I get that all the time. But I am currently I'm a visiting assistant professor at the University of Mississippi in Oxford, Mississippi. And I'm on a couple-year assignment working at the Declaration of Independence Center for the Study of American Freedom down there, which is a center that does work in politics and history and law and so forth that's attached to the College of Liberal Arts. I am a fifth-year, all but dissertation PhD candidate at Hillsdale College. So I was at Hillsdale from 2019 until just this past December and January when we moved down to Mississippi doing my PhD there in politics. And I am writing my dissertation on the political thought of Jonathan Mayhew, who was an 18th century congregational minister in Boston on the eve of the Revolution. So I am deep in the weeds of religious and political tracts and sermons, pamphlets, and discourse and so forth of the 18th century, trying to sift through the material and figure out what were the strands of influences at the time of the founding. So, and I am also this summer, I'm a visiting visiting fellow at the American Reformer. And that's where this article was written as part of my work this summer, in which my friend and contributing editor, Mike Sabo, we teamed up together to tackle this issue of the propositional nation, which was in the news, both because vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance and President Biden were talking about America as an idea, each taking oppositional approaches to it. So it's been an issue, it's come up quite a bit in the past, say, decade since 2016 and Trump's run for presidency then. So yeah, it's a lot of people have been talking about it, so we thought it was time to put some ideas to paper and really hammer out a long form, deep analysis of the matter.
Awesome. And we'll definitely get into it in greater detail as we go through our discussion. But before we get started, for you listeners, feel free to check out our Substack if you haven't already, forgeandanvil.substack.com. You can put in your email for free, and you can see that is where we host the entire show in every single episode in order as they come out on podcast platforms. Will get sent straight to your email if you sign up there. There's also a tip option if you want to throw something in the tip jar. I'd appreciate it, but of course, no obligation for you guys. Feel free to like and share this video. It boosts us in the algorithms. It really does help. And of course, follow us on Twitter at Forge and A for additional content and updates on the show. And I always fail to say this on these pre-recorded episodes, but we are pre-recording this episode. So if it shows that we are live, we are not actually live. But if you do happen to go to our Substack and become a paid supporter, you do get this episode the very next day after I pre-record it, as opposed to several days later. So you get an early release. So feel free to let that be a little bit of incentive if you want to join our community there. But either way, we'll go ahead and dive straight in now that all the laundry is out of the way. So yeah, Ben, of course, J.D. Vance had some of the most recent remarks talking about America not being a propositional nation. Of course, a lot of individuals have been freaking out, including individuals on the right. So before we dive straight into your article, what was kind of your initial reaction to JD Vance and his remarks?
Yeah, I thought his remarks were right on the money. He says America is not just an idea, it's a group of people with a shared history and a common future. It is, in short, a nation. So, what he's talking about there is the origin of a people and the common purpose they have as a people. Now, that is extraordinarily important to have this concept of a people. And then out of that grows a nation, which is a political entity that helps represent the people kind of in a shared international perspective. Um, so I thought what he had to say was it wasn't just true, now or true historically. It's just sensible. It's actually how all people have viewed themselves throughout human history. The idea that you can have a political entity, whether it's a Greek city state or a Roman Empire or a Swiss canton or a Germanic feudal people or whatever it may be, and they don't have a common land, a common tie by blood or kin or custom, language, religion, ways of life, calendars, sacred ideas, unspoken norms, and so forth. All of these things typically are called nomos or nomoi, the law or the custom of a people. The idea that you wouldn't look to those things to define yourself as a political peoplehood is absurd. It's crazy. And of course, this is what the whole background to this is. The talk um, really in the 20th century, the scholarship, academic scholarship, and the founding was looking for what makes America exceptional. Oh, it's what makes America exceptional is it's not all these other things. It's not blood and soil. We have to distinguish ourselves from those very nasty fascist Nazi ideas from the world wars. America's not blood and soil. It's not primarily a land. It's not primarily a people. It's an idea. This is what makes America exceptional. This is what makes us unique. This is why we're not like any nation in all of world history. This is the Novus Ordo Seclorum that the founders talked about, the new order of the ages. This is represented in the Declaration of Independence. And therefore, um, we can open our borders to the world. And not only can we kind of democratize and domesticate the world according to our civilizational ethos, but we can export all of that around the world. So therefore, you have nation building, democracy in the Middle East, and so forth. All of this is predicated on this idea that America is exceptional because it's philosophical, it's a nation. If you just get the other people to agree with your ideas, then voila, you can recreate America somewhere else, or you can make anybody an American. So that's a lot of the background ideology behind Vance's comments, and this is why people, really freak out, because it has been part of the discourse for so many decades, and it's been what people kind of grew up on. Well, this is what makes America unique. This is how we're not like Germany or we're not like Japan. We don't have these ties of blood. We're simply bound by a shared ideology, a belief in rights, liberty, equality, freedom, the ideals of the Declaration of the Constitution. And so we just have to become a citizen. You just have to swear allegiance to the Constitution, and that's it. You have maybe some kind of residency requirement to live here for a time. Of course, anybody who is seeking their citizenship ends up living here much longer than the requirement because the system's so broken it just takes forever. But yeah, like that's it. So it's a very kind of abstract, detached way of perceiving citizenship and civilization and nationhood, which is an anomaly throughout human history. And I would argue, as Vance is saying, it's also an anomaly according to American history and the American founding. So I thought Vance's his words and ideas were right on the mark, but it's also not at all surprising that you have people like Ben Shapiro kind of freaking out. And just to say on this point, the reason for this is that if you don't have a common heritage with the things that people kind of realize makes America unique, i.e., we came out of English and Western European political and legal systems. America was deeply, deeply, if not almost exclusively Christian at the time of the founding, and well from the colonial period. If you say are an immigrant from China, or you're, I don't know where Ben is from, but he's Jewish, so you're not Christian, then suddenly you could feel very threatened if it's not true that America's an idea. Like, where do I belong? I don't fit here anymore. Somebody's going to deport me or kick me out or estrange me or make me a second class citizen because suddenly I don't share the common religion of Christianity, or I can't trace my heritage to English or German or Swiss or Nordic or whatever it may be, French heritage or something like that. So it's a deeply visceral resistance, because automatically there's an understanding that if America is not an idea, then maybe I don't belong here if I don't meet the right qualifications. And it actually brings up great opportunities to talk about, okay, well, what do we do if America is not an idea and it's actually a homeland?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It really does boil down to, it seems, based on what you're saying and what I've kind of understood from the general discourse in recent months, is that it really boils down to that post World War II consensus that individuals don't want to let go of the world that was sort of created after World War II. We can argue whether we think that world is great or not, but either way, it's not the world of the founding fathers. The world of the founding fathers was much different than the America after World War II. Can we say that they're both great? Sure, we can make those arguments, but those arguments are ultimately irrelevant to what JD Vance was saying, and of course what you're saying in your piece, which is that ultimately this idea of America being more than just ideas, being an actual group of people and an actual place, was an idea that was shared by the founders. And of course, you go into that in your piece that you and Mike wrote. And I would encourage all you listeners. It's called "The Myth of the Propositional Nation" on AmericanReformer.org. I'll try to put it in the show notes for all of you to follow along if you want. But you talk a lot about how the founders knew that America was more than a bundle of ideas. So talk to us a little bit more about the founders and their perspective on America as a whole.
Absolutely. We opened the piece by giving kind of some quotes by the founders, John Jay and James Madison and um, Alexander Hamilton and others, even the Declaration of Independence, that show that they had a self-awareness that America was, it was people with a common language. Jay talks about having the same ancestors and the same religion. They have the same principles of government, and that came out of a collective experience in the colonial period of self-government. Basically, the English or the British had a a policy of salutary neglect, where we were, colonies under imperial oversight, but they kind of just left us alone to do what we want, and that's how the colonists came to establish their own traditions of self-government. Those were the principles of government that they held very dear, and the basis upon which they resisted what they felt was parliamentary encroachment and absolute sovereignty over them in the 1760s and 70s. And we have the same manners, the same customs. We've fought together in the same war, and we've mingled our blood in a common cause, and that ties people together very closely. And so the founders themselves were not afraid to talk about these elements, these ties of blood, both by ancestry and by a common cause, and ties of religion, ties of language, the fact that we share a geographical space. And the amazing thing about American geography is that it's isolated by two huge, massive oceans, bodies of water. And of course, at the time, in the 18th century, there was very little contact with Mexico or the Western territories beyond the Ohio and the Mississippi River. And so it was mostly the French and French Quebec, and the Spanish in Florida, and that was it. And those, of course, France and Spain were European powers, so very common in terms of the other peoples besides the Indians, the other peoples that the colonists would have had in contact with. So a shared geography, a shared kind of land, and the unique thing about the American land is that it was so open. If you had a conflict or a disagreement with somebody, or you wanted to just establish your own, your own homestead, your own church, your own farmland, you just pick a piece of land that was unoccupied. You'd move west, you'd move south, and it was there for the taking. It wasn't crowded like England or continental Europe. So these actual physical, tangible uh, kind of rhythms of life shaped the American people. It shaped the colonists and made them into a certain kind of people. And that's what the founders are talking about. They're talking about this common shared.
I think we got disconnected for just a brief second there, Ben.
So yes, you could these common experiences of living in a particular geographical space shape the American people, and this is what the founding generation was talking about. And of course, by the time they're writing in the 1770s and 1780s, the colonists have had 150 years collective experience with this. So this is not a brief period of time. This is 5 or 6 generations. So the founding generation, of course, understood these things. And there's a huge debate in the literature. Was the American founding, was it fought over? Did the colonists defend their way of life? Was it based on the defense of and protection of the rights of Englishmen, their particular English heritage, or was it based upon so-called natural rights, some kind of natural or divine appeal to heaven? And of course, the Declaration of Independence talks about natural rights, that government is instituted for the sake of protecting natural rights. This is the end of government. And so there is an element of the appeal to nature and the appeal to the divine. And these would be ideas or propositions. You could talk about the idea of property, the right to property, and these are the things that are universal. And so in our piece, we talk about some of these universal, natural, and divine principles. But the colonists were doing this for the sake of protecting substantively the ways of life that were very particular to them. So the English had long had a history of self-government, of representative government. They'd had a glorious revolution in which they had, kind of decided on the supremacy of Parliament as a representative body over against an absolute monarch. That shaped the American people quite a bit, and the English experience highly prioritized the rights of property and jury rights or juridical rights. And so these were these kind of substantive things the colonists did not want to lose. But when it became clear that they were going to have to break away from Great Britain, they had to appeal to a standard or a principle over and above and against the very people they came out of and they were trying to break away from. So there is an appeal to universal principles, but for the sake of protecting something that's very particular, that is theirs. And we get into this in the piece a little bit, and we talk about how the very nature of politics is a prudential matter. It's part of the practical intellect. And so it requires, anytime you're going to decide, do we fight a war? How do we do that? Do we establish government? How do we do that? Do we protect what rights and liberties? How do we do that? You're using the practical intellect, and the practical intellect requires both an appeal to right principles, because the practical intellect, you could read the piece, we get into how it's a faculty of right reason to be able to determine what's the right thing to do in this particular situation. So you do have to have an appeal to some kind of moral or moral principle or principle of justice. That is, the principle itself, of course, is universal, but then the actual particular application of it, it's very specific. So we get into that a little bit to show, sure, they appealed to, these universal principles, but they they applied it in a very particular way. And the outcome was not just the protection of a way of life, but also the creation of, in some ways, a unique way of life. So, for example, and I'll stop rambling here and let you say something. Um, the uh, the American Constitution is a unique constitution. It's not the parliamentary system in England. It has separation of powers and an independent judiciary and representation as a principle that was applied more thoroughly than had ever been practiced before. Um, and it has, this concept of an extended sphere, meaning you're going to use representative government over a large territory, which Baron de Montesquieu thought wasn't possible. And so they're taking Montesquieuian principles or ideas and they're expanding them and adapting them. So what comes out of the American founding is in some ways something unique, but it's something that is deeply tied to their particular English and Christian, really Protestant ways of life as well. So it is a mix, but you can't just say, well, the only person who can be an American is if you can trace, your English heritage back, I don't know, 10 generations or something. Or America isn't anything but abstract ideas. Both of those are errors on the extremes.
Yeah. Yeah, I had Nate Hockman on the show a couple months back, I think at this point, and he was talking a lot about that. It was kind of during the heated debate of whether or not the Constitution is dead, and Nate was saying that the Constitution was, of course, just putting pen to paper about the principles and the traditions of the people that were already there in the colonies at the time of the document being written. I've also heard before, though, that in a way that is sort of a sign uh, of a decline of those things. It can be seen that way, at least. The moment that a people group feels as though they need to put to paper things that are supposed to be these common threads among their civilization, you could argue that the fact that they even had to put it to paper is perhaps a reason to believe that those things were, of course, in direct had direct threats to them, essentially. Which, and again, may also be another reason why we could say that the American colonies were so Christianized, because there wasn't a ton of explicit language saying we are a Christian nation, at least in the founding documents. Because, of course, when they're talking about freedom of religion, the founding fathers were, of course, talking about it from a standpoint of this territory is gonna be one Protestant denomination. This territory is gonna be another, because it was very much a Protestant nation, but there was different denominational beliefs within the states, and many states in their state constitutions, of course, had a state religion. But what's your thoughts on just the value of writing these things down? Because of course it gives us a snapshot into a people group at the time. But do you believe that that is true? That the moment that some of those things are put in writing, it's because some of those things are, I guess, in danger of perishing?
That's an interesting question. It could be the case, although, again, you have to appeal to the American experience going back to 1607 and 1620. And what you find is that the Americans, from the very beginning of the colonies, were writing down their constitutions and their laws. So the earliest kind of law code written constitution is the Pilgrim Code of Law in 1636. So they had had a very long history of this that was very different than the English history. Of course, the English Constitution was not written. Common law was kind of this rolling, understood by the courts and the justices. I mean, it's a very sensible system. There's nothing wrong with it if you have enough homogeneity and agreement, and you have virtuous, well-respected, capable leaders who are intent upon preserving good order in society and not having a cultural revolution every generation. So, an unwritten constitutional way of life for a nation is very doable if you have the right conditions, material conditions. But of course, in America, part of the reason for the writing was that many of the colonies had grants from chartered companies, London Company, Pilgrim Company, and so forth, in terms of they had a charter telling them you could settle in this area, and then you can establish your own government. It's a grant of power, but then they have to do it. And they're starting over from scratch. And they're Christian, they're people of the word, they're deep in the word, they value the written word, and so they choose to write down their laws and to live by them. So I think it's not, in the American experience, going back to the colonies, it's not necessarily a sign of decline or decay if by 1787, 17, you know, really the Articles of Confederation began being drafted in 1776, and that was the first constitution. So from the 1770s, the writing of the national constitution, that just fell right in line with the American political experience. So in the American case, I don't necessarily think it is a sign of decline. Now, it can be a problem if you have undue trust that a people or the government itself is going to abide by parchment paper. And you have Madison talking about this very problem in the Federalist, saying, we all know that parchment isn't going to stop a ambitious person, if vindictive, voracious, ambitious person, if they want to take power. So they all agreed that the first and the last kind of bulwark to stop tyranny was the people. It was the people themselves. The people had to be a particular kind of people. And here we get back to, actually, it's not just your ideas, it's your way of life. You have to be a
Mm.
particular kind of person. You have to have good character. You have to have virtue. You have to be acknowledge God, and you have to be humble, and you have to have good relations with your other citizens, and it has to be a high trust society. You need a particular kind of people and material in order for them to hold their elected officials accountable, and for those officials to actually, respect that. If they think the people are stupid, materialistic, crass, vicious, and can be placated with, Netflix and TikTok and, Domino's Pizza, then you just give them all of that, and then you rule how you want. So it is in part a condemnation of us that our rulers are so vicious and irresponsible today. They're taking advantage of, the decay of the American people. So the founders certainly understood these issues, and they tried to take as many measures as they reasonably could to preserve the American matter, so to speak. In our article, Mike and I talk a little bit about form and matter, and this is kind of Aristotelian categories of, well, you have the form of the American founding, the nation. You could talk about it in terms of the principles of the Declaration and the application and the legal form of the Constitution. And you have the Articles of Confederation and the Northwest Ordinance. Those are the four organic laws of the United States. But then you have all of the, like you said, the unspoken things. There was just tons of agreement. They didn't have to explain things that they all agreed upon or knew. And of course, it takes a lot of, hard historical, sociological, political, legal work in the primary sources for us to recover that, because it has been lost in terms of a general knowledge of what those common assumptions and common ways of life were. So things like blasphemy laws at the state level strike us as being crazy. But of course, they were just like, well, of course you're going to have that. I mean, you can't have seditious talk in the community, and you can't have some crazy teenager slandering, Jesus as the Son of God and the Virgin Mary as a whore. You can't have that. That's desecrating the community's religion, and that's not allowed. That's going to lead to the destruction of society. So those kinds of things, you have to read deep into case law, and to get to these, those are the assumptions of the material way of life, and all of that, of course, predates long before 1776. So I mean, that's probably the best short answer I could give to the question of, is a written constitution preferable or not? And of course, what we have today, we have the written constitution on paper, and then we have the actual constitution. We do have, in a sense, an unwritten constitution, and how it works today. Christopher Caldwell, of course, talks about this quite a
Mhm.
bit in his book, The Age of Enlightenment. So it is, in one sense, you're always going to have an unwritten body of jurisprudence that's going to help case law, basically, that's going to help inform how you interpret the written. I think also the advantage of a written constitution is that it does form what's called foundational law.
Hmm.
So in the English system, you don't have foundational law; you just have rolling statutory law, and which makes basically Parliament a constitutional convention, a rolling constitutional convention, because there is no foundation that keeps Parliament in check, so to speak. You could change the very foundation of, say, property rights or jury rights, and the only reason you don't do that is because the people wouldn't let you. Those are sacred. That's the ancient Constitution. It goes back 1,000 years. You can't do that. So it is this kind of self-respecting, high trust community that keeps legislatures and jurists restrained from destroying these ancient customs that are cherished by the people. But in the American system, you take those cherished things, you put them into foundational law. You say you can only change them through constitutional amendment, or if you have a constitutional convention, and then the legislature can only decide on uh, matters of statutory law. So they have to abide by the Constitution. So it's a different system. They each have strengths and weaknesses. So
Yeah. Yeah, and in your piece, there's two big things I kind of wanted to tackle with the remainder of our time here because I think they're both very important to our current discussions. One is nationalism, and then of course I want to also make sure that we hit on the dangers of the propositionalism. But talk a little bit about nationalism because, of course, that is now branded to be a dirty word in American political discord. But of course, nationalism itself is viewed quite differently by the founding generation than how we view nationalism today. So, talk to us a little bit more about that.
so nationalism for the founders was a very natural thing. They came out of the law of nations tradition, and the law of nations tradition just applied the natural law to nations. And in order to do that, it had to conceive of nations as being moral persons. So this might strike us as a strange idea. How does a nation a moral person? Well, you kind of get an idea of it in modern corporate law, where you have a business is called an individual or a person in terms of dealing with legal matters. It has to conceive of, say, Microsoft or Apple or whatever as a single entity, not just a collection of the individuals and the bylaws that compose it. The same thing can be applied to a nation. And of course, this idea goes all the way back to Plato, who in the Republic is talking about how a city is like the soul of a person. And so he's making this analogy between a city and a person, trying to understand the parts of the city and how they're properly ordered and harmonized. So in the law of nations tradition, the nation is a moral person. It's united um, by the common wills and the common ends of a people. And then, of course, you have representatives that represents that will. That in the representative, you have the actual act of uniting of these people in action, and the act of doing something. So whether it's making a law or a treaty or defending the people in a war, whatever it may be. So the idea that nationalism, this talk of nationalism, is some kind of post German Bismarckian bureaucratic German romantic Hegelian dialogue, all this kind of stuff. No, 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 no. The nationalism discourse went way back to, of course, the Treaty of Westphalia in the 1640s. Uh, the very idea of a nation as distinct from other nations, in many ways, comes out of the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, and specifically the English Reformation. And this whole idea of cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm, their religion. So you're tying a physical, geographical space to a particular expression of religion. So you're going to have Protestantism in England, or maybe not. Maybe you're going to have Catholicism. We're going to fight a war over that. Okay. We're going to have to figure that out. We're going to have Lutheranism in Germany. We're going to have Catholicism in Spain and France, so forth. So the very, this discourse on nationalism was very ancient, even by the time of the founding. So you have the founders talking about being a nation. How do you make a nation? All over the place. So it shouldn't freak us out. The only reason it freaks us out is because we're completely dominated by kind of the specter of World War II and this idea of the return of the strong gods, like Rusty Reno talks about these loyalties to God, to religion, to truth, to one's kin and neighbor and custom and land and so forth. And that this is what caused the death of, 20 million in World War I and 60 million in World War II, or whatever the crazy number is. And if we want to avoid all of that, if we want world peace, we can't have nationalism. So anyway, a nation is a entity, a moral entity. It has, in a sense, it's very difficult to uh, parse it out in terms of ontology, but there is a sense in which it's not just an aggregation of the individuals in that community. There is something there. There is something that you have loyalty to, a love for, a nostalgia for, a way of life, and it's hard uh, to splice and dice it, uh, either philosophically or phenomenologically. But we know it's there. You know that you're part of the American nation. I'm not part of the Japanese nation. I'm not a part of the Brazilian nation, and I know that there's a distinction there. So the nation is something real. It has some kind of mystical union, some kind of reality there, and that's what the founders were trying to get at. And they worked very hard in many ways to try to overcome the very strong attachments to local and communal ways of life that kind of functioned as a force that would pull them apart. Uh, and I could get into the technicalities of how they changed the legal form of the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution in order to do that. I won't go into all of that right now. Um, but they had to work very hard for the first 100 years of the existence of America to try to attach the American people to their nation, because the people were so attached to their states and to their local ways of life. And so, of course, what you have in America is you almost have nations within nations, because the states originally were their independent republics and independent nations. They kind of had their own constitutions. They had their own governors, their own court system, their own legislative councils and assemblies. They had their own way of life. They basically had their own militias. So they could conduct foreign policy. So you even have like a nation made up of other nations. Of course, the concept of a confederation or a federate republic. So how you have loyalty to both your state and your national entity or political grouping was a very tricky thing. And that's why actually there's this tradition of dual citizenship in America. Everybody is a
Mm.
citizen of their state and a citizen of the nation. And so the American synthesis here is extremely unique. Um, but we shouldn't fear the talk of a nation. There's certainly any political grouping could, of course, be taken to an extreme. Part of the part of nationalism is that it is a conversation between a central political government and the individual, whereas a confederation is a conversation between state governments as corporate entities and the national government as kind of an umbrella over them all. So you can get a kind of severe individualism in which you just have the relationship between the individual and the national power without any intermediary political units, not the family, not your local council, your local government, not your state government, or anything like that. That can be extremely dangerous. That's where you do get totalitarianism, and kind of a cloning of the citizen and a reduction of them to a serf.
Hmm.
So there were dangers there, and the founders recognized these dangers, but they also understood you couldn't exist without being a nation.
Mm.
Otherwise, the states were going to tear each other apart, go their 13 separate ways, and have civil war amongst each other.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course you've mentioned some of them already, but there's quite a few issues that come up with propositionalism. But to your point, with just the idea of nationalism in general, we of course see from Scripture, we can see that God, of course, establishes nations. That's very clear in the text, and of course, we can see in examples like the Tower of Babel or Babel, whatever your preferred pronunciation, that globalism is, of course, not a God endorsed proposition. And then, of course, neither is tribalism, as, of course, the tribes of Judah ultimately were united into a nation that was established directly by God. So we can, of course, make the argument for nationalism from the scriptures. But of course, going back to the propositional nation, you've already mentioned some of the dangers, but what other dangers did you want to highlight with the remainder of our time here?
Yeah, so the main danger is that actually the idea of a propositional nation is actually the negation of a nation.
Hmm.
So you can't actually form bonds with other people over just abstract ideas. There has to be a shared way of life. Now, certainly the nature of the human being is that our ideas deeply shape our conception of ourselves, conception of the world, and then our action. So ideas and behavior are melded together in the human person in which you can't really tear them apart. And of course, human action and behavior then reinforces or it debunks the ideas that we have. And so this is a very complex phenomenon of how these things influence each other. But you cannot just have one or the other. You're going to have ideas and you're going to have a material way of life. And so trying to just get everybody to agree. I mean, when was the last time all Americans agreed on opinion about whatever, equality, the role of men and women, voting, this and that policy, abortion, immigration, whatever. It's like, if there's anything, uh, is there anything more assured than disagreement over opinions in, human society? Of course not. So there's a huge danger here that you actually will not get a commonality of opinion. Sure, some immigrants will come in and they'll say, I don't know anything about America, but I can say this oath in my naturalization ceremony, and that makes me a citizen. And I get the perks of citizenship. But that doesn't get actually make them loyal to America. So the major danger of propositional nationhood is that it undermines and eventually destroy the nation. You won't have a nation. What you'll have is just a random collection of individuals, these kind of subgroups or subcommunities that are all going their separate ways. And the only way to control them all is through an ever strengthening central power that tries to dominate
Hmm.
them all. And it dominates them through either coercion and force and intimidation. We see that happening, or by placating their material needs and wants. Let
Yeah.
us rule over you, and we'll give you anything you want. We'll give you prosperity, we'll give you a job, and we'll call this the American dream. There is such a thing as the American dream, but it's not just material prosperity.
Right.
So the danger of the propositional nation is that it destroys the nation. And of course, it opens the door. It says anybody can become an American. So it kind of gives credence to this idea of open borders. And you know, ba- there's a whole history here of the 1965 Immigration Act did away with the 1924 Immigration Act, in which was trying to tamp down massive immigration. More than a million a year had been coming in since 1900, and had not been successfully assimilated or integrated in any way. And so they had quota systems in the 1920s and 30s, saying we have to cap it. Only so many people from certain regions and parts of the world were favored over other parts, to say, hey, look, like, somebody from uh, Western Europe is going to be able to more easily integrate than Eastern Europe. somebody from Asia is way different than somebody from anywhere from Europe. So just obvious commonsensical distinctions between different types of people. Propositional nationhood destroys all that. And of course, what you have in the 1965 Immigration Act is an elimination of all the quota systems or any kind of ethnic, religious, characterological requirements. All of those had been present previously, that you had to be a person of outstanding moral character. And what was the moral character that was, the standard? Well, some kind of classical and Christian morality. Okay.
Right.
So that's gone now. So you have change in immigration law, which lends credence to this idea of a propositional nation. You have rhetoric about America as an idea, which then reinforces the fact that just anybody can come here, and pretty soon America just becomes this kind of campground for the world's immigrants. Anybody could come here, can take a slice. So that's the destruction of a nation as well. We talked a little bit about the end of any kind of loyalty or commonality. So this idea of the common good. If you read into the founding documents at all, you'll find that they actually believed the common good was the end of government, and the common good was just these substantive goods of human life. Some of them were material, safety, protection, property rights, the right to association, right of movement, freedom of religion. Others were more noble: freedom of religion, freedom of speech and assembly, and so forth, the right to self-government. These substantive goods were the common good that the American people were trying to preserve. And of course, if you've studied other civilizations, you know that something like, say, juridical rights, innocent until proven guilty, the right of habeas corpus, the right to face your accuser in court, to bring your own witnesses, to have a trial by jury. Those are substantive goods. That's part of the common good. But if you live in a mafia-run state or a gang system like in Mexico, you don't have that. Maybe you're not considered innocent until proven guilty. You're just shot if you happen to be part of the wrong gang, or you get mixed up with the wrong person. Too bad. You're dead on the side of the road. So the common good is lost. With that comes injustice, suffering. You basically have a return to a state of nature. People will begin to organize themselves locally into militias, into governments, and you basically have the fracturing of America and the end of America as a people and a nation. So those are massive dangers. Maybe we shouldn't reduce America to an idea.
Yeah. Yeah, and unfortunately, as you've laid it out, those in power really benefit from perpetuating the propositional nation myth. And so it's important that we have these conversations where we can point it out. I'm honestly very encouraged that we have someone at such a high level of political office, being JD Vance, a senator, a U.S. senator, and of course now vice presidential candidate, that understands that we are not a propositional nation, and he has enough sense to actually lean into that. And I'm hoping that that is a big encouragement to you listeners as well, because ultimately it's been a long time since we've had someone in such a high office, outside of perhaps Trump. But of course, Trump, I don't think could articulate it the same way that JD Vance has. But that's an encouraging development to see that we're starting to understand that. I think the base has understood it for a long time, but even among the base, more of us are becoming aware of the broader political thought of the founding, and of course everything leading up to the founding, that was lost. And men like you, Ben, and Mike, writing such great content is definitely helping the layperson like me to recover that bit of knowledge. And so I really appreciate you writing the piece, and we could definitely keep going on there, because there's a lot of great content in the piece. So I'll just go ahead and link it in the description for you listeners to consume it in its entirety on AmericanReformer.org. So be sure to check it out there. But Ben, where can people go to keep up with you and everything that you have going on?
The best place to find me is my Twitter handle, Ben R Crenshaw. Um, I guess I'm technically on Facebook, but I don't I don't do anything. I'm not on Instagram or any other social media. So it's mostly Twitter, and it's a mix there of um, you know, substantive posts, historical retrieval, and then some kind of modern political sparring with different factions. Definitely, some people need to get SWAT down. So yeah, you can find me there, and of course, my writing is at American Reformer. I have written some things for the American Mind um, at the Claremont Institute, but right now it's American Reformer.
Awesome. Well, thanks a bunch for joining me, Ben. Really appreciate that. Did you have something additional?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, Connor, you had mentioned the post-liberal consensus. I do have a very, very long form, like almost 10,000 word article I wrote a month ago for American Reformer outlining the post-war consensus. So if listeners are interested in what is the post-war consensus, I hear this idea thrown around, and I'm not sure what's all involved. You can go to my page on American Reformer. You could read all about it there.
Awesome, and maybe we'll have you back for an episode just on that, and we can dive into that topic further as well. But thanks for joining, Ben, and thank you, listeners, for joining us. And of course, if you haven't already, go over to our Substack, forgeandanvil.substack.com. You can put in your email for free, get everything sent directly to your email whenever the episodes drop in podcast format. And of course, I do put up some additional writing there occasionally. And my first American Reformer article actually released this week as well. So feel free to check that out. All about conquering the fear of aging. So be sure to take a look at that. I'd appreciate it, and share this video far and wide. We appreciate your viewership. It really does help us out a bunch, and we'll see you next time.